So in this demo, I'm going to be covering the Google Chart API, specifically the image charts option. Google Chart API has a variety of tools within it, but the image charts end up being the most convenient and the simplest ones to use, so I figured it might be the one that you might want to use. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the other chart APIs available, chart frameworks, if you will, namely the ones that came out of Stanford, which is known as Protoviz. What's nice about Protoviz is it provides you with lots and lots of flexibility. Essentially, it deconstructs a single graph into its various components such that you don't draw data as an entire entity necessarily, but as a combination of individual components. So you can do some really neat stuff without actually having to resort to images. This may look like an image, but it is actually using JSON data. And so while this is a little more complicated, and actually its successor is known as D3, and D3 is also very, very elegant in being able to render graphics or render sort of data in a graphical form using a variety of principles. But this is for something, if you like data visualization, I strongly encourage to take DataViz 448b if you're not in it already, or just download these examples. All of these have great examples that you can start off with and explore. So back to the Google Charts API. The nice thing about the image charts themselves is that the images themselves encode the data that's represented in it. And this includes everything from the type of chart that it's going to be, to the colors of the individual components, to the labeling that's applied, to whether or not it's 3D, to whether or not it's stacked. And you might say to yourself, well, how can that be? So let's actually explore. If you click on any of the examples, and if you'd like to follow along, do go to the code.google.com/apis/chart/image. You should come to a variety of examples right here. And if you just hit the center one, for example, and you did right-click and copy image URL, you should actually be able to open that into a new tab and see the exact same image, which is nothing impressive in and of itself. But if you look at the URL that the image is located at, you actually see that it also encodes some of the data. Now, you don't actually see what each of these percentages represent, but that's because it actually uses a sort of concatenated version of the data that encodes all 3 or 4 of these components in 4 characters, which is neat, and we'll explore why that and how that can actually be. But this chart type is P2, which means it's a pie chart with 3D. Let's see what P2 does. It doesn't seem to have anything. We can actually break. If you do P, it just has a simple pie chart. That's great. You would expect this to be something related to size, and that if you play around with the parameters, yes, indeed, it changes the size. And without any surprise, if you change this to Rio, you would change that particular string to Rio. So that's the general premise of this of the chart API. Let's actually go and dive in a little bit and sort of deconstruct the individual parameters so that we know that we can make something we want without having to break apart something and fool around with it for endless amounts of time. So the example, so if you click on the gallery link, you'll see a variety of things that you can actually make. I'm going to imagine that most of what you'd like to make is actually encoded here. They've done a really nice job of trying to put examples for every conceivable type of chart that you'd like to make. So line charts are really nice for seeing sort of differences in data. Bar charts are good for comparisons and the like. So if you hit bar chart, for example, if you'd like to follow along, there's all sorts of examples that you can use. And if you go through these one by one, what they'll do is they'll define the type of chart, so whether or not it's horizontal, whether or not it's grouped, bar, or stacked. Is it, are they horizontally, as I mentioned? What colors do they use? And what labels are applied? how much spacing there is, and all sorts of details that you can explore to your heart's content. And I'm sure any example that I make here won't cover what you'd like, but let's take a look just for kicks. One that actually has data encoded. And so each of the parameters that you need to consider yourself are going to be start basically with ch, and the values corresponding to that are going to be the things that you're going to put on the other side of the equal sign. So if you're looking for trying to customize a chart type, you would say cht equals and the 3-letter or whatever number of things that correspond to that parameter. Right, so if we were to look at chart type for the one that we just saw, the cht equals p corresponds to the fact that it's a pie chart. And so in this case, we're actually going to make a, let's see, we're going to actually make a grouped vertical chart, BVG, right? So we can actually start off by copying the image URL, and I'm actually going to create a brand new demo file. And obviously we can have an image tag with that URL in place. And if we were to actually take a look at what that contains, it's a bar chart. That's great. So if we pick apart the content, we actually don't see anything related to the data. Actually, we do. CHD equals hello world. And if we were to say, change that to egotistically Rio, it actually changes the values corresponding to the encoded data that the RIO corresponds to. And that doesn't really make sense. So actually, let's take a look at an example which actually encodes the specific values. And we can actually do that ourselves without looking at an example. Basically, the CHD, and let's actually take a look at the documentation. The chart data type should actually be, let's see, chart yes, it's not actually right here. It's actually in data formats on the left. How it's a little obscure, but it does need its own explanation because there are a variety of things you can do. The most simplest one is to actually put in all your data, and it's nice and it's convenient. So let's give that a whirl. We need to put in t as our first parameter and whatever number of things that we want to encode. So let's say 10, 5, 50. So we should be able to see a chart that actually has 10, 5, and 50. And we haven't sort of labeled what's going to happen on we don't know what this 0 to 100 or whatever it is. Let's make sure that we can put those labels in place as well. So let's go back. And so before I go through that, I want to highlight the fact that the last of the multiple formats that they have, the last one is the string encoded format, which is basically a way to collapse that string data such that it actually contains all the data that you'd like without actually exposing it, or for the more ideal scenarios is that it actually collapses the data, right? So if we were to type in Rio, for example, that would or R, the letter R, it corresponds to 43, right? So I corresponds to 34, and O corresponds to 40, and this is their own algorithm. They have a way to encode the entire URL string. I wonder if they actually have a tool that will let you encode a variety of things. Apparently not. Oh, maybe. Let's see what that happens. No, it doesn't. This one is an extended encoding format, so it actually doesn't apply. It basically lets you encode data from 0 to 4095. So they have their own integrated algorithm. It is a little more detailed than this tutorial can cover, but if you're interested in collapsing data and making your URL a little shorter, that's the way to go. So let's go back and let's add a label to our chart. We can do that by using chart axis styles and labels. And we can provide a variety of axes. Basically, the axis that you provide is the parameter is chxt. And if we take a look, this URL does not have chxt. So anywhere you'd like, you can just bam, just put in chxt and provide whatever axis that you'd like to have provided. So x comma y. Let's see if that actually does what we want. Ah, there we go. And now we know what these particular values correspond to. If you'd like, you can also explore the extent to which those values go from 0 to, so chxr, right? And so you could say, I want the left axis to the y-axis to go from 0 to 60 and stuff like that. So I'll leave it at that. But let's take a look at then how to make the API a little more dynamic. And this example will be pretty brief because maybe some of you will just turn off the video at this point and say, aha, now I know how to work it. But the general premise of what we're going to do is we're going to dynamically update the URL such that it contains the same exact, well, it contains user encoded data. Right, so let's take a look at chart.php, which should be part of the code that you either download or obtain using SVN. And the code that's contained basically has a set of an area that's called results, which has nothing, absolutely nothing in it, and it has a area that basically lets people put in data. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually send whatever is being inputted to another file called getchart.php, which will then render the image and return it in the format we'd like. And our code is basically going to then take the return data and put it into results. So before we actually get going on building the chart and doing the sort of database transactions and all the things that we'd like to do, we first have to consider whether or not we would want a database. The idea is that we want to save something and we want to be able to actually access that same information at a later time and be able to update it. Now there are ways to do it without a database, and some people might think that this is a little heavy-handed than it should be. But to get sort of MySQL and PHP sort of hammered in, why don't we nonetheless go about using a database? So if you take a look at your database, it should be something like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a table that contains that will contain all the parameters for this particular image. Now remember, our actual goal is to have something like let's see, I think I actually, yes. So our goal is to have something like this, where each of the values, when we update them, get reflected in the database. So we want to be able to save all of this data somewhere. And so I'm going to call that table, actually if you take a look at the SQL file, I've called it data. And somewhat potentially inefficiently, I've created one column for each of the data values. If you'd like to be more efficient or better about this, you can actually concatenate all the data that actually gets sent in and save it as a single array that is comma separated or pipe separated, such that you could just extract that and put it into the image, right? If you take a look at this URL, you'll actually see that each of the data points that's in the chart is right here in the CHD parameter. So if you saved all of this as a single row in your database, you'd be a lot more efficient than the approach that I'm doing. But I'm not, this was something I coded up, so well, let's just go ahead with that. always question the status quo. So the approach that we can do is we can just copy and paste the SQL file and run it as run it. In which case it should create a data table that contains x1, x2, x3, and that's great. Now we're going to create a getChart.php file that actually gets the data, right? And it doesn't make it, it's always, I make it a practice of mine to always put in some sort of dummy data so that I'm not stuck whenever I'm stuck at some point and can tell that it's either my code not working instead of there's something being, everything working, but the data not actually representing what we want, or that there not being any data. So we just created a new array. We have a thing called time. We'll need time for one reason, and the reason being that we would only want to get the latest item that's been inserted. The alternative to do that is actually to create a single ID column at the very beginning and auto increment that. Just as a reminder as how to do that, you would go to your structure tab. At the beginning of the table, you would create one field, call it ID, give it an integer value, and as a on the auto increment thing, you would just click yes. So that's one approach. I've actually gone ahead and done time just to make things a lot more complicated, but you could definitely do something like this, in which case every row would be given a number that would correspond to an ordered fashion such that the latest one would be the highest number, right? So that would make your life a lot easier than doing something as crazy as like I did. But let's proceed nonetheless. So I'm going to basically copy and paste code from the examples from variant that I've done. I will share this code just to get you guys running. I think some of you are in a crunch. But basically the general idea is that when you get sent data, actually before we even handle setting the data, let's ignore that. Let's get from the data table the one that is the most recent, and let's get only one of them. Let's assign all the values we want just for simplicity's sake, and then let's create an image from Google Charts that contains that x1, x2, x3 piped, and this is a specific data format for a bar graph that is vertical and grouped. Obviously, this same approach can apply to anything that you'd like to create, be it a vertical var chart or a pie chart or whatever, but the general idea is that you want to replace the data parameters with the exact values that you have in your database. So if you were to go and go to getChart.php, let me just copy and paste exactly all of that, and let's take a look at what it contains. It should getChart.php should show clearly it's not showing anything. It's telling me that there's a SQL error. Great. What could that be? It could be forgetting to put in data for my host configuration. Let's see. I wonder why that is. I could just... So a good lecturer like Jennifer Whittam would probably stop the video right now and save herself the embarrassment of not having prepared this well, but I would just schlep it from somewhere else. So if we refresh, this data should actually represent the dummy data that we just inserted. So the 10, 4, 5, 10, 5, 5, 10, that's the wrong window, sorry, 10, oh, it clearly is not. Why would that be? Well, it's because I'm referring to the wrong database. So that's an instance where if you're actually not paying attention, you can actually create havoc for yourself, because the same servers could actually connect to multiple databases. Now that's actually an interesting thing. It must be a security issue where Stanford's actually allowing connections from non-Stanford. Oh, actually no, I'm connecting on a... No, it's weird. Anyhow, ignore me. So if I put in my parameters correctly, it should actually connect to the right database. And so it should have 10, that doesn't look right, does it? I wonder why. 10, that is why. So I've somewhat stupidly called it x1, x2, x3, where x1 is the first chart of the first one, and x2 is the second bar from the second group. So 10, 4, 5, 10, 5, 5, so that should be 10, 4, 5, 10, 5, 5, and 9, 10, 11. And doesn't it goes without saying that there could be better ways, but the premise should be pretty much the same, and then maybe it's a good exercise to just take this and say, where did Rio go wrong? How could I make it better? So having fixed the config information, let's go back to our chart. This is the wrong chart. And our get chart does exactly that. It creates an image tag containing all of the data that we'd like, right? So all that remains is actually making that nice sort of Ajax-y approach, where what we do is that whenever we have an insertion to the data, we update the database, and then we reload the image that brings back the image that corresponds to the most recent data. So let's do that. So this is the ideal format. If we take a look at what we have right now, chart.php should be blank. Actually, no, it shouldn't. It has this, but it doesn't do anything. So let's first create the way to actually first retrieve the data from the database and show it here without actually doing any of the saving and form submission complication. And the way we would do that is to actually do a GET request. So this is my copy and paste approach. If we copy and paste it, basically the approach that I'm saying is I'm saying do an AJAX call to get chart.php without any parameters that need to be sent. And the callback function, the function that gets called right after the data, is that whatever this AJAX call is performed, the data gets populated into the div with the ID results, which is conveniently located right here. So if we save that, we should actually see that this is our first load of data that came back from and represents exactly the same exact image as the one in getchart.php. That's what the callback function is doing, right? So that's fine, but if we update data, nothing gets sent. Notice here that we're actually, if we keep things as they are, everything gets sent in a get format. But what we want to do is we want to arrest that. We want to prevent it from doing anything that we don't want it to. We actually want to bind the submission process of the form. This is the form, right? We want to bind the submit button process such that it captures all the data, sends it to get chart.php, and then let's get chart.php handle all the sort of update process of the database, and then does exactly the same thing of putting the results into the HTML. And so the JavaScript to do that is basically right here, right? So I'm making a post request now, the distinction just being the sort of purely philosophical. And right here is a little trick. I'm serializing all the data, and this is one of the niceties of jQuery. I'm basically taking form, the object with ID AR, and we're serializing that data. And serializing only works for a form, because a form actually does sort of collapse all the information. Once you remember, all the things that are being sent are the things with the names and the inputs. And so when you do that, essentially what gets sent is something like x1 equals 1 and x2 equals, like as I'm sure you're familiar. Once that gets sent, the callback basically does exactly what it does right here, except it adds a little bit of niceties where it fades out the existing image, puts in the new data, just like it does right here, and then fades it back in. This is all nice and dandy, except getchart.php doesn't do any of the data insertion as it is right now, right? And so that's where the approach of what we're going to do is we're going to say, if there is some data being sent over to me, which I don't know if there is, right? Because in the first case, we were all we were doing was just displaying data. But we can overload getchart.php such that it can actually contain the script to actually insert data. And the way we do that is actually, if you take a look at your code, it should look something like this. So the general idea is, and once again, this is somewhat of a hack, it could be improved, but basically what it's saying is x1 as a post variable being set, that is it being given to me, and is it also blank? Now the reason why this is potentially problematic, although almost conditionally guaranteed, is that ideally you want to sort of do some validation on data in general. But I'm making the premise that if I send data, it's always going to contain x1. And if it does, then we run the insert query into the database, insert MySQL query, so insert into data, whatever is being sent as x1, whatever is being sent as x2, etc. The last value is the time. Time is a special PHP function that does not have a $sign, so be aware of that. And so basically what that does is, if you send me data, I will insert data. And so that's really convenient, because if you look right here, we're actually sending data in one case and not sending data in another. And so we should be pretty much done with our demo. If we update one of the values, that updates the value. If we take a look at our database and see what was happening right there, that the latest one, the first one was our dummy data, the latest one has a time value now, and since we didn't insert any data, by default we have set it to 0. The reason behind that is because it is an int. If we had changed this as a var, we would have made no guarantees whatsoever as to what it could potentially contain. But since our structure enforces that the parameter must be an int, the default always becomes 0 if nothing is being sent, right? So right here, if we were to send data, we get that. So notice, obviously, this actually overflows the image. That's because I haven't set the axes to be intelligently conformant to whatever is the maximum of the data. But I hope this was helpful, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me.